The millionaire's son had never spoken a single word, not to his father, not to a therapist, not even to himself. At 5 years old, Aidan Thorne was a silent figure, moving through life like a ghost, a perfectly healthy child by every medical standard. No neurological issues, no hearing loss, no physical damage, yet not a single sound had ever left his lips. His silence was so absolute and so haunting that even the house he lived in seemed to hold its breath. A 12-bedroom estate tucked into the hills of Greenwich, Connecticut. Marble floors, glass staircases, a piano that hadn't been played in years. The staff moved quietly as if afraid to disturb something sacred or broken. His father, Derek Thorne, was a man who had conquered the world by 35, a tech CEO, a billionaire, a widower. A man whose brilliance in business only highlighted his failures at home. Since the accident that took his wife Derek had retreated behind boardroom walls, speaking in shareholder reports, not lullabies. He loved his son, of course. He just didn't know how to reach him. There was no shortage of trying. Therapists from New York, Boston, and even Switzerland had walked through the Thorne estate. Some came with dolls and flashcards, others with iPads and clinical data. They all left the same way, quiet, defeated, paid handsomely for their time, but none closer to unlocking the fortress of Aidan's silence. Until Elise Harper arrived. She was not what Derek expected, not a specialist, not a licensed child psychologist, just a nanny barely 26, with an education she never finished and a debt she never escaped. She came with a resume that didn't impress and shoes that were clearly second-hand. But she had something no one else did. She had no agenda. She came to take care of a child, not fix him, not diagnose him, not deliver a miracle, just care. The first time Derek saw her, she was standing in the rain, her canvas bag soaked through, holding a crumpled paper folder to her chest, as if it might blow away. She looked fragile, but her eyes were steady, not bold, not scared, just present. She looked up at the mansion like she had stepped into another world. Because she had. It was Derek's mother who had found her, Grace Thorne, a woman of few words and deep instincts. She had met Elise in a coffee shop downtown, watching the young woman offer her last $5 to a homeless man without hesitation. That was all Grace needed to know. Sometimes she believed kindness was more valuable than qualifications. Derek resisted. Another nanny meant another disappointment. But Grace insisted. Just 1 week. Give her 7 days. Derek agreed, but only because he no longer expected anything from anyone. On her first day, Elise met Aidan in the playroom. He was sitting on the window seat, staring at the rain, his tiny hands pressed against the glass. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't blink, just watched the sky. Elise didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She just sat near him, pulled a small book from her bag, and began reading aloud. Her voice was soft, untrained, a little shaky, but she read with feeling, pausing for laughter that never came and gasps that never arrived. She did the same the next day, and the next, and the one after that. No reaction, no movement. Until the 5th day. Aidan looked at her, just for a second, but it was the first time in 5 years he had acknowledged another human being. It should have been nothing, a glance, a flicker. But for Elise, it was the beginning of something she could feel in her bones. He was in there, somewhere behind the silence, waiting. Sometimes the most broken voices don't come from the throat. They come from the heart. And sometimes it only takes one person who refuses to give up to make them speak again. This is how it began, with a silent boy, a grieving father, and a young woman with nothing left to lose, and none of them had any idea what would happen next. Elise Harper never imagined her life would come to this. At 26, she had once stood at the top of her class at Columbia, majoring in child development with dreams of opening her own center for special needs children. Her professors said she had a gift, an intuitive ability to connect with children others struggled to reach. But gifts don't pay bills, and when her father was diagnosed with late-stage cancer, everything changed. She left school 2 semesters before graduation to care for him full-time. The hospital visits drained her savings. The medication drained her hope. After he passed, she and her little sister Mia were left with a pile of debt and a crumbling 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. Elise took whatever work she could find. She cleaned houses, waited tables, stocked grocery shelves overnight, all while making sure Mia got to school, ate 3 meals, and still believed in the future. Her resume grew thin, but her hands grew strong. She applied for the nanny job at the Thorne estate, out of desperation, not expectation. The listing sounded impossible. High pay, live-in, non-disclosure agreement required. Child with special needs, no contact allowed with press or outside parties. It sounded more like a security job than a childcare position. But Mia needed school supplies. The rent was overdue. Elise filled out the application and sent it expecting silence. Instead, she got a call within 24 hours. A woman named Grace Thorne wanted to meet her. The meeting was brief. Grace sat across from Elise at a cafe table, observing her in silence for most of the conversation. Elise apologized for her lack of credentials, her unfinished degree, the gaps in her employment. Grace only nodded. At the end, she asked one question. If someone you loved stopped speaking to the world, how long would you wait for them to say something? Elise replied without hesitation. As long as it took. Grace smiled for the first time and handed her an address. Be there Monday morning at 9, pack for a full week. Elise barely slept the night before. She borrowed a rolling suitcase from a neighbor and packed 3 outfits, 2 books, and a childhood photo of her and Mia. She arrived early. The estate looked like something out of a movie gates, taller than most houses' hedges, trimmed to impossible symmetry, a fountain that sparkled even in the overcast light. The front door was opened by a man in a suit who didn't smile. She was shown to a guest room bigger than her entire apartment. The bed was made with sheets that probably cost more than her monthly groceries, but nothing felt warm. Elise changed into her plain navy dress and waited. It was Grace who introduced her to Aiden. The little boy stood by the window, motionless as if carved from silence. His blonde hair fell just past his eyebrows. His pale fingers rested gently on the glass. He didn't look at her. Grace whispered that he hadn't spoken a word since the accident 2 years ago. Elise's heart clenched. 2 years, not a word, not even a sound. She took a small step forward, then stopped. She didn't speak to him. She didn't kneel. She simply sat down on the floor a few feet away and took out a book from her bag. She began reading. The words were for her, not for him. But she read anyway. That became the routine. Mornings in the playroom, evenings in the garden. Elise followed Aiden, not directing him, only shadowing his world gently. She sang lullabies while folding laundry. She hummed tunes while slicing apples. She drew pictures and left them on the corner of the table. Not once did she ask him to speak. She gave him space without silence, comfort without pressure, and though he never responded, she noticed the small things. His eyes flickering toward her hands when she moved, his head tilting slightly when she sang, the way he would sometimes stand just a little closer to her shadow. She started talking to him about ordinary things. Her little sister's science project, the terrible sandwich she had once eaten on a bus, the way her father used to make Sunday pancakes with chocolate chip smiley faces. None of it meant to heal, just to be present. And somewhere deep inside the quiet mansion, filled with walls of grief and marble, something began to shift. Elise didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just talking to Aiden. She was waking up a story he had buried so deep, not even he remembered it was there. And that story was waiting for the one person brave enough to sit in silence long enough to hear it. Derek Thorne had built empires before he turned 30. The tech world called him a genius, a visionary, a machine of logic and innovation, but no one ever called him gentle. He wasn't born into wealth. His childhood was spent in the Bronx, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still found time to teach him chess at night. He earned every cent he had by solving problems no one else could. His company revolutionized cloud security. Investors called him untouchable. But Derek hadn't smiled in almost 2 years. Not a real smile. Not since the accident. His wife Lillian had been everything he wasn't. Warm, spontaneous, recklessly optimistic. They met at a TED Talk where she was photographing the event and he was presenting. She said she loved how awkward he was on stage. He said nothing. She asked him out anyway. They married a year later. When Aiden was born, she lit up every room just by talking about him. Derek didn't know how to be a father, but he watched Lillian and copied her. He never told her that. Then came the storm, a thunderstorm that turned a normal Tuesday afternoon into a nightmare. Lillian was driving Aiden home from preschool. A truck skidded on the wet road, slammed into their car, and killed her instantly. Aiden had no physical injuries. But when Derek arrived at the hospital, his son sat motionless on the gurney, staring into nothing. Not crying, not moving, just silence. It had been that way ever since. Derek threw money at the problem, hired the best specialists in the country, flew in experts from overseas. They ran tests, charts, hypnotherapy, sound baths. Nothing worked. Each failure chipped away at him until only cold control remained. He couldn't save his wife. He couldn't fix his son. So he did the only thing he knew. He worked, meetings, deals, expansion. He let Grace, his mother, run the house, let the staff rotate in and out, let the therapists come and go. But Aiden stayed silent, day after day, week after week, until Elise showed up. Derek noticed her immediately, not because of beauty or charm, but because she didn't try to impress anyone. She didn't pitch ideas or strategies. She didn't tell him what Aiden needed. She simply existed, quietly, persistently. That unsettled him. On the 3rd day, Derek came home early from a meeting. He passed the hallway and heard something odd. Laughter, not Aiden's, Elise's. She was laughing softly at something in the playroom. Curious, he stepped closer and peeked in. She was sitting cross-legged on the rug, trying to balance 3 rubber ducks on top of each other like a tower. Aiden sat across from her, unmoving, but his eyes were locked on the ducks. Derek didn't interrupt. He just stood there watching. That night, he replayed the scene in his mind more times than he wanted to admit. The next morning he found himself pausing at the top of the staircase, listening for her voice. She was humming. A simple melody, something from a children's show. Derek didn't recognize it, but it calmed him. He shook the feeling off. This wasn't therapy. This wasn't science. This was just a girl with no qualifications, trying to distract a broken child. Still, Aiden had looked at her. That hadn't happened with anyone else. Derek hated how much that meant. One night, Grace confronted him in the kitchen. She was cutting apples, and he was pretending to read an email. She said Elise was doing more for Aiden in 4 days than all the professionals had in 2 years. Derek dismissed it, said it was a fluke, a coincidence. But deep down, a voice he couldn't silence asked what if it wasn't? What if the answer wasn't in strategy or science? What if it was in presence, in being seen? He didn't like that thought, because it meant he had failed, and Derek Thorne didn't like to fail, especially not as a father. But he was failing, and the girl with the second-hand shoes and the canvas bag was starting to make him question everything he thought he knew. By the end of the first week, Elise had memorized the layout of the mansion, not just the rooms, but the energy each space carried. The library was cold and untouched, filled with untouched books and untouched memories. The kitchen, although spotless, lacked the warmth of a home-cooked meal. The playroom was the only place where a flicker of life remained, and even then it clung to the corners like dust waiting to be noticed. Every morning, Elise followed the same ritual. She prepared a tray with a few apple slices, water, and a toy rotated daily. She never placed them directly in Aiden's hands. She set them on a small table within his line of sight. She didn't chase his attention. She simply made herself available. On the 7th day, Derek joined them in the room, unannounced. He stood near the door, watching. Elise didn't acknowledge him. She was reading a picture book about a lion who lost his roar. Her voice was animated but not exaggerated. Aiden was sitting by the window, as always, staring at the sky. Derek stayed for 5 minutes before leaving. That night, he asked Grace if Elise had any formal training in child trauma. Grace said no. He asked if she had any prior experience with mute children. Again, no. He sighed, frustrated. "What are we doing then?" he asked. Grace looked at him and said, "Maybe for once we're just trying to be human." The next morning, the tension was clear. Derek hovered more than usual. He asked Elise several pointed questions about her methods, her goals, her timeline. She answered calmly, saying she had no methods, no timeline, only intention. That didn't sit well with him. He wasn't used to vague answers. Later that day, Elise was sitting in the garden with Aiden. It was unusually warm for October. She was humming again, braiding dandelions into a loose crown. Aiden was nearby, building a tower with stones. He wasn't speaking, but he was mimicking her rhythm. Derek appeared at the glass door, arms crossed. Elise noticed him, but didn't flinch. After dinner, he confronted her. He told her that while he appreciated her presence, he needed measurable results. Aiden needed to show improvement, not just silent interaction. Elise looked at him and replied, "Aiden doesn't need performance. He needs safety." Derek's jaw clenched. He said, "I hired you to help him, not to play pretend." Elise stood still. She said, "I'm not pretending, I'm showing up." Maybe that's something he hasn't had in a long time. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Elise returned to her room that night, feeling more alone than ever. She wasn't afraid of losing the job. she was afraid of losing the chance to reach Aiden. This wasn't just about employment, this was about something deeper. She knew what it was like to feel unseen, to scream inside and have no one hear you. She wasn't going to abandon a child going through the same, not without trying everything, even if that meant defying the man who owned the house. The next morning she arrived in the playroom early. She brought a small box of materials, yarn, paper, crayons. A tiny plastic xylophone she had borrowed from the neighbor's toddler. She arranged them neatly and waited. Aiden came in quietly as usual, sat by the window. Elise didn't speak. She began tying the yarn into simple shapes. She tapped the xylophone lightly. Nothing musical, just patterns. She crumpled paper into snowballs and gently tossed one across the room. It hit her own shoulder. She gasped dramatically. Aiden didn't laugh, but his eyes moved. That was enough. Derek came in an hour later, saw the toys, the mess, the absurdity of it all. He shook his head, said nothing, and left. Elise exhaled. She was walking a fine line, but she had decided she would rather get fired doing what felt right than stay safe doing what felt meaningless, because something in Aiden's silence wasn't empty. It was waiting, and Elise wasn't going to stop listening. The next few days passed with a quiet tension woven into the walls of the Thorne estate. Derek kept his distance, but was always watching. Elise kept her focus on Aiden, refusing to let the invisible pressure shift her approach. Her methods weren't conventional. She didn't follow a plan laid out by specialists or chase milestones on a checklist. She followed feeling. One afternoon, while Aiden sat by the sliding glass doors, staring at the garden, Elise began cutting colored paper into strange shapes. She arranged them on the floor without a word, slowly forming a large tree. Aiden didn't move, but he blinked. Once, then again. She added a sun, then small blue strips for rain. Then she stood up and walked away, leaving it unfinished. The next day the sun had been moved half an inch. Elise noticed said nothing but smiled softly to herself. Something was waking up in him. Something small and silent and steady. She began incorporating sound into their days, not through speech, but through rhythm. She tapped her fingers against cups, drummed softly on tabletops, stirred water with spoons. She used rhythm to fill the space between words, not to provoke a response, but to give his silence a language. Aiden never reacted outwardly, but one day he began drumming his own fingers against the window ledge, matching her beat. It lasted only 5 seconds, but it felt like a symphony. Derek noticed too. He stopped asking her about progress. Instead, he started lingering a little longer in the mornings, pausing near doorways, sipping his coffee slower. Grace watched him with quiet satisfaction. One evening, Elise sat at the edge of the fountain outside. The sun was low, the air cool. She had her journal open, but wasn't writing. Aiden approached, slowly carrying a leaf. He didn't hand it to her. He just placed it beside her and sat down, close enough for their shoulders to almost touch. Elise didn't look at him. She just whispered, "Thank you." The next morning, Derek saw them in the garden. Aiden was sitting cross-legged on the grass, while Elise blew bubbles into the air. A few popped on his cheeks. He didn't flinch. Instead, he reached out slowly and tried to catch one. His fingers missed, but his eyes followed the next one. It was the most motion Derek had seen in his son since the funeral. That night, he knocked on Elise's door. She opened it, surprised. He asked how she knew what to do. Elise hesitated, then answered, "I don't know what I'm doing. I just know what I needed when I was 5. Derek didn't respond. He simply nodded and walked away. For the first time, Elise saw something break in his posture. Not weakness, not defeat, but surrender. The kind that comes from realizing control won't heal what's broken. Only love will. The next day, Elise introduced music. Not classical or children's songs. She brought a small Bluetooth speaker and played recordings of Rain-Wind Bird's soft piano. She placed it near the window and let it run. Aiden turned toward it, then toward her. His eyes searched hers for something unspoken. That was the first time he reached out and touched the speaker. Briefly, gently, like it might disappear. Elise knew she was getting closer. She also knew the moment wouldn't last forever. Something was building. She could feel it. Not just in Aiden, but in the air, in Derek. In the walls of the house that had been quiet for far too long. And deep down she hoped that when the moment finally came, they would all be brave enough to meet it, even if it broke them first. It was a Thursday morning when Elise decided to try something different. The air was thick with pre-storm humidity, the kind that made windows fog at the corners and left the house feeling too quiet. She came into the playroom with an old shoebox tucked under her arm, the kind with colored tape along the edges and stickers peeling from its sides. Inside were small items she had collected over the years, objects that made sound not because they were instruments, but because they lived in the world. A bell from her father's old bike, a jar of marbles, a tiny sand timer, an old baby rattle, 2 wooden spoons. She placed the box in front of Aiden without explanation and sat down. He didn't look at her, but he noticed the box. She opened the lid slowly and let each sound happen as it would the soft jingle of the bell, the glassy clink of marbles, the grainy fall of sand. She didn't force rhythm or melody, she just listened. After a few minutes, she passed the rattle across the carpet, and for the first time, Aiden reached out and picked something up without being prompted. He held it in both hands, shook it once, then placed it back. Elise didn't celebrate. She just whispered, "That's nice," and let it be. An hour later, she brought in the therapy ball. It was bright red and dusty from lack of use. She remembered using one in school, how it helped with core engagement sensory development and spatial awareness. She asked Grace for permission, and Grace agreed. But she didn't tell Derek. She thought he wouldn't notice. Aiden was hesitant at first. He wouldn't sit on the ball, but he touched it, then leaned against it. Elise rolled it gently toward him, bumping his knees. He smiled, a tiny, fleeting smile, the first she had ever seen. Elise's heart clenched. She moved slowly, keeping her voice soft, like guiding a deer through a clearing. She invited him to sit, and after a long pause, he did. With both arms wrapped around the ball feet, barely touching the floor, he let her gently rock him forward and back, left and right. It was the closest thing to physical trust they had shared. Then the door slammed open. Derek stood in the doorway, eyes wide, chest rising fast. His voice cut through the room. "What are you doing?" Elise froze. Aiden immediately dropped to the floor, crawling backward into the corner like a frightened animal. Derek stormed in, staring at the therapy ball like it was a bomb. Elise tried to explain, her voice shaking. "This is a sensory tool, it's safe." "He's responding well." Derek didn't let her finish. "You don't get to experiment on my son. You're not licensed. You're not even a graduate. You don't know what you're doing." Elise stood still, swallowing the lump in her throat. I know he smiled, she said quietly. I know he sat. I know that for a moment he trusted me. Derek's voice dropped low and cold. I asked for progress, not risk. You're done. Elise looked at Aiden curled into himself in the corner, his hands gripping his own shirt. Then she looked at Derek. You're not angry because I tried something. You're angry because it worked. And you weren't the one who did it. He didn't answer. He turned around and walked out. Grace came in 10 minutes later, eyes already knowing. She touched Elise's shoulder and said softly, He's scared, but that doesn't excuse this. I'll try to talk to him. Elise packed her bag. She didn't cry, not yet. She left the playroom with quiet steps and didn't say goodbye to Aiden. She didn't think he would notice, but he did. And that night, when the rain began to fall and thunder rolled far in the distance, Aiden stood by the same window he always did. Only this time he pressed his hands to the glass, not in silence but in protest, and his lips began to move. No one heard it, not yet. But the silence was cracking, and the storm wasn't just outside anymore. The rain came harder than expected, sheets of it falling in waves against the mansion windows. Thunder rolling low and long across the hills. The kind of storm that demanded attention, the kind that silenced everything else. Derek stood alone in his office, staring out into the darkness, a glass of untouched whiskey on the table beside him. He couldn't stop hearing her voice, the calm defiance, the unwavering belief. You're not angry because I tried something. You're angry because it worked, and you weren't the one who did it. It echoed louder than the thunder. For the first time in months, maybe years, Derek questioned himself not as a CEO, but as a father. Downstairs, Grace stood near the front entrance, watching the storm through the open door. She clutched a shawl around her shoulders, waiting, hoping Elise might come back, even just to grab something she forgot. But Elise didn't return. Not yet. In the playroom, Aiden stood by the window, his small frame silhouetted against the gray light. His teddy bear hung limply from one hand. His eyes weren't on the rain. They were searching the driveway, searching for her. Elise had not said goodbye. No hug, no words, just absence. For a child who lived in silence, her silence now was unbearable. The doorbell rang, sharp, unexpected, cutting through the thunder. Derek moved fast, faster than he realized. When he opened the door, he found her standing there soaked to the skin, rain dripping from her hair, clutching her canvas bag like it was her only anchor. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Grace exhaled behind him, then turned and walked away. Derek stood aside, letting Elise enter without a word. She was trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. She looked like someone who had run out of choices. I just needed to say goodbye, she said quietly, her voice cracking at the edges. I didn't want to leave like that. Derek swallowed hard. He nodded. He wanted to say more, but words failed him. Then they both heard it, a sound, small, fragile, from the hallway above. Elise turned first, her eyes wide. Derek followed, frozen. Aiden stood at the top of the stairs, barefoot pajamas, wrinkled his hair damp. From leaning too close to the glass, he looked at Elise. His lips moved. One word, clear, soft, unmistakable. Don't. Elise gasped. She didn't move. Aiden took one step forward, then another. His face was pale but focused, his voice trembling as he repeated it. Don't go. Derek's heart stopped. Elise dropped her bag to the floor. She stepped forward slowly, afraid the moment might vanish if she breathed too loud. Aiden reached the last step, stopped, and looked at her like she was the only person in the world. "Don't go," he said again. Louder this time, the syllables rough but real. Tears flooded Elise's eyes. She crouched down, arms open, and for the first time in 2 years, Aiden ran. Not perfectly, not fast, but he ran into her arms and buried his face in her shoulder. Elise held him like her life depended on it. Derek stood frozen, his throat tight, his eyes wide. He felt something crack inside, something old and bitter and long ignored. He moved closer, one hesitant step at a time. Elise looked up at him, tears streaking her cheeks. He spoke, his voice hoarse. He talked. Elise nodded. "I heard him. They didn't say more. They didn't need to." The silence had finally broken, and from within it, a voice had returned. Not just Aiden's, but all of theirs. The house wasn't quiet anymore. The storm outside still raged, but inside, something softer had begun. Healing. It started with one word, spoken not from the lips, but from the heart. And it was enough. The day after Aiden spoke, the rain stopped, but the air inside the mansion remained heavy, as if it too needed time to understand what had just happened. Derek barely slept. He kept replaying the moment again and again in his head. Not just the sound of his son's voice, but the look in his eyes, the way he ran to Elise, the way her arms wrapped around him like a lifeline. For the first time in years, Derek felt helpless in a different way. Not from failure, but from awe. He didn't know what to do with it. The next morning, Elise woke in her guest room with sunlight slipping through the curtains. Her clothes still damp from the night before, her eyes swollen from crying. But there was peace in her chest, a stillness she hadn't known in months. When she came downstairs, she found Grace at the kitchen table, sipping tea. There was already a warm mug waiting for her. "He hasn't stopped looking at the stairs since you came back," Grace said with a small smile. Elise sat quietly. "I didn't think it would happen like that." Grace reached over and touched her hand. "You didn't make it happen. You made space for it to happen. There's a difference." That afternoon, Derek asked Elise to join him in the garden. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation without an agenda. They walked without speaking for a while, the trimmed hedges and soft gravel beneath their feet, marking a path neither of them had taken before. Finally, Derek stopped near the fountain. His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I owe you more than an apology." Elise looked at him, unsure how to answer. He continued, "I've spent the last 2 years trying to control everything around me because I couldn't control the one thing that mattered. I thought fixing Aiden meant forcing a solution, but you taught me that sometimes the best thing you can do is show up and listen." Elise said nothing, she just listened. Derek turned to face her. "I need your help, not just with Aiden, with me. I don't know how to do this." Elise met his eyes, and for the first time there was no wall between them. Only grief, only truth, only a quiet plea for connection. So they began again, slowly. Derek shortened his work days. He started joining the playroom sessions not to observe but to participate. He sat on the floor. He made block towers with Aiden. He laughed when they collapsed. Sometimes he cried when no one was looking. Aiden began saying more, small words, simple phrases. Elise celebrated every syllable like it was a symphony. They never forced him. They simply invited him. Day by day, the silence that had ruled the mansion began to dissolve. Music returned not through speakers, but through humming and soft footsteps, and the occasional squeal of laughter. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen island eating grilled cheese sandwiches, Aiden looked at his father and said, "Daddy." Derek dropped his fork. Elise froze. Aiden repeated it, more confident this time. "Daddy." Derek leaned forward, his eyes wet. "I'm here. I'm right here." Aiden smiled. The next morning, Derek brought down an old photo album. It was dusty and untouched since the accident. Together they flipped through pages of memories of Lillian holding baby Aiden, of her silly faces, of birthday parties and beach days. Derek spoke about her for the first time, not in pain, but in love. He said she would have loved Elise. Elise didn't respond. She just reached for his hand and held it. There was nothing romantic in the gesture. Not yet. Only recognition. A joining of two people learning to rebuild from the rubble. And Aiden, sitting between them, said nothing that day. But he didn't need to. His presence was a sentence on its own. And the house, once filled with cold silence, was now filled with the sound of life slowly returning. By the second month, routine had become comfort, and comfort had become something closer to belonging. Elise still lived in the guest room, but it no longer felt temporary. The staff no longer called her Miss Harper. They called her Elise. Aiden no longer waited at the window each morning. He waited at her door. Sometimes he came with a crayon in hand, sometimes with a book, sometimes with nothing at all, but the quiet confidence that she would be there. Derek watched these changes with silent gratitude, but also with something deeper, something unfamiliar. He wasn't just grateful for Elise's presence anymore. He was drawn to her, not in the obvious way, not in the way he had been drawn to Lillian's spark, or the easy chemistry of young love. This was slower, steadier. A feeling that settled in his chest when he saw her humming softly while folding laundry or reading to Aiden in silly voices that made the boy giggle until he rolled over. One evening after Aiden had gone to sleep, Derek found Elise on the back patio wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea. He joined her without a word. They sat together watching the stars blink through the cloudless sky. After a while, he spoke. "I used to think I was done. That love wasn't something I deserved a second time." Elise didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the horizon, and now she asked. Derek exhaled. "I don't know. But when I see you with him, when I hear him speak your name, before he says mine, when I watch you light up this house, in ways I never could, I start to believe maybe some things come back around." Elise turned to him then. Her eyes were tired but clear. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I know," he said. "You're not replacing her. You're helping us remember how to live again. And that's something no one else could do." The moment hung there heavy but gentle. No confessions, no kisses. Just truth laid bare in the quiet. In the weeks that followed, Derek began inviting Elise to dinner as more than the nanny. They talked about books, about childhood, about dreams they both thought they had given up on. One night, Elise told him about her father, about leaving school, about Mia, her sister, who was applying for college now, because of the stability Elise had been able to provide. Derek listened not as a boss, but as a man who finally understood the weight of sacrifice. He offered to help with tuition. Elise refused, not out of pride, but because some things were meant to be earned through the struggle. That night, as she walked up the stairs, Derek watched her go, feeling something warm settle into the hollow space he had carried for so long. One weekend, they took Aiden to the beach, not the Caribbean, just a quiet shoreline 2 hours from the estate. Aiden built sandcastles with Elise, while Derek took photos surprised at how natural it felt. No pretense, no performance, just 3 people making space for joy. Aiden laughed when the tide washed away his castle. Derek laughed too. Elise caught the sound on her phone and played it back later that night, tucked under the covers with Aiden beside her. "This is what healing looks like," she whispered. "Not loud, not perfect, just honest." Back at the mansion, the days continued with a new softness. Aiden now spoke in short sentences. His favorite word was again because he liked things repeated stories, songs, even hugs. Derek spent less time at work, more time at home. Grace, watching from the sidelines, saw what was happening before they did. One evening, as Elise passed her in the hallway, Grace stopped her and said, "You've done more than save that boy. You've brought my son back to life." Elise didn't know what to say. She simply knotted her throat tight. In the stillness of that night, Derek stood at Aiden's door watching his son sleep. He turned to Elise, who stood behind him, and whispered, "I don't think I ever believed we'd be here." Elise looked at him, not with certainty but with quiet knowing. "We're not at the end," she said. "We're at the beginning." And Derek, for the first time in a very long time, believed her. Autumn returned to Connecticut with golden leaves and crisp air, wrapping the Thorne estate in a quiet kind of warmth that hadn't existed there for years. The trees blushed red and gold, the fountain trickled gently again, and inside the once cold house, signs of life had taken root. Aiden now spoke freely in short bursts. He laughed when Derek carried him on his shoulders through the backyard and called Elise to come see everything from up here. He asked for bedtime stories and repeated lines out loud. He started to hum to himself during walks and danced awkwardly in the kitchen when Elise played music while making pancakes. Derek smiled more. He worked less. And when he did work, he brought his laptop to the playroom just to be near them. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Elise found a drawing on her pillow. It was Aiden's. 3 stick figures holding hands, one with short hair, one with long hair, one small one in between. Written beneath in block letters was a sentence, "My family." Elise sat on the bed staring at it, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. When she showed it to Derek that night, he didn't say anything. He just placed a hand on her shoulder and let the silence speak for them. A week later, Derek asked Elise to join him and Aiden for a small outing. He said it was a surprise. They drove for over an hour through winding country roads until they reached a small white house tucked behind a row of tall pine trees. There was a porch swing, a garden, a view of a lake. "It's ours," Derek said quietly. "I bought it, not to replace anything but to start something new." Elise blinked, unsure what he meant. He knelt on one knee and pulled out a small box. Not flashy, not expensive, just simple and quiet, like everything they had built together. "I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm asking if you'll keep walking with us. If you'll be the person Aiden already believes you are. If you'll let us be your home." Elise didn't cry. Not yet. She reached down and helped him stand, then wrapped her arms around him and whispered yes, so softly it felt like a prayer. When Aiden ran into their arms moments later, clutching a bouquet of crushed wildflowers, Elise laughed through her tears. That night, back at the estate, the 3 of them sat on the floor of the playroom building a puzzle. One piece was missing, as it always seemed to be, but no one cared. The picture was clear enough. Aiden yawned mid-story and leaned into Elise's shoulder. Derek rested his head against the wall and looked at them both. There was no music playing, no grand speech, just peace. The kind that comes after storms, the kind that takes time. Months later, on a bright winter morning, they moved into the lake house. Elise started a part-time degree program online, and Derek built a home office overlooking the water. Aiden decorated his room with drawings and fairy lights. And every night before bed, he whispered goodnight to both of them, no longer afraid his voice wouldn't be heard. One night, as they sat on the porch swing, wrapped in the same blanket, Elise looked out at the frozen lake and said, "Do you ever wonder how different things would be if I hadn't shown up that day?" Derek shook his head. "You would have found us eventually. We were waiting for you." Elise smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. The wind was gentle, the stars above quiet and kind. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was home. And though there would always be echoes of the past grief that flickered in the background, and fears that sometimes knocked quietly at the door, they had each other. A child who had learned to speak, a man who had learned to feel, a woman who had dared to stay. Their story hadn't begun with romance or perfection. It had begun with silence, with a boy who had never spoken, with a woman who chose to listen. And in that silence, love had grown. Quiet, fierce, unshakable. Years later, the lake house remained, though the seasons had changed it in small ways. The porch swing was now faded from sun and snow, the garden richer with wild flowers and memory. Inside the kitchen carried the scent of cinnamon and coffee, and the walls bore drawings not framed, but taped up carelessly joyfully, like a museum curated by a child. Aiden was older, now taller, with curiosity in his eyes and steady confidence in his voice. He spoke freely, laughed often, and rarely stopped asking questions. He still carried the teddy bear Elise had given him years ago, though now it lived mostly on a shelf near his bed, a quiet relic of the boy he used to be. One evening, while Elise cleaned out an old cabinet in the guest room now turned into a home office, she found a folder tucked behind a stack of old books. Inside was the original job listing for the nanny position. She read it slowly, remembering the version of herself who had answered it without hope, only need. Attached to it was a short handwritten note she had never seen before. It was from Grace. "Sometimes healing doesn't come from credentials. It comes from courage. I believe you have it." Elise smiled, holding the paper to her chest. Grace had passed a year earlier, peacefully with both her son and grandson by her side. They buried her near the lake beneath a willow tree she had often sat under in the late afternoons. It had become Aiden's favorite place to read. Derek came into the room, his sleeves rolled up, a smudge of flour on his cheek. They were baking together more often these days, usually at Aiden's request. He noticed the paper in her hand and raised an eyebrow. "Old memories," she nodded, "the ones that still matter." He stepped closer and kissed the side of her head. "Everything that matters started with you showing up." That night, Aiden asked if he could write a story for school about the day he first spoke. Elise and Derek glanced at each other unsure. "Are you ready to share that?" Derek asked. Aiden nodded. "I think someone else might be waiting to speak too. Maybe my story will help." Elise blinked back tears. They let him write it alone, trusting his voice the way they had once trusted his silence. He titled it "The Day the Rain Spoke," and it began with one sentence. I was quiet for a long time, but not because I had nothing to say. I was just waiting for someone who knew how to hear me. When the story was published in the school newsletter, it reached more than just classmates. It reached a teacher who had been doubting her impact, a father who hadn't spoken to his son in months, and a mother trying to find words for her child's silence. The messages came slowly, then all at once. Elise read them aloud in the evenings while Derek listened, with his hand resting gently over hers. The story of the boy who once never spoke had become a voice for others. Not loud, not forced, just present. And in that presence, something powerful had taken root. In the stillness of a home once filled with grief, a family had been born. Aiden with his quiet strength, Derek with his humbled heart, Elise with her open hands. And every day they chose to love each other, not because it was easy, but because they had once lived in a world without it. Now they refused to take it for granted. In the end, the most incredible part of the story wasn't that Aiden had spoken. It was that someone had waited long enough to hear him, and that somehow was enough to change everything.